I'm going to do today is to really cast the making of Singapore. By the making of Singapore, what I'm referring to is how Singapore became, in 1965, an independent sovereign state. And instead of adopting just an internal narrative of the decisions that led to it, I will try always to refer those decisions to the larger frame that influenced the way in which the outcomes happened in the 1960s, in the late 1950s and in the 1960s. And in that period, of course, the large frame around the world was that of the Cold War. So I'm trying now to position Singapore's history amidst the context of the Cold War, and we'll try to explain how it influenced developments in Singapore. So this was the picture around late 1950s, 1960s. So I'll just quickly recap. Rising nationalist movement, former colonies wanting to assert their independence from former colonies. Former European colonies, very, very weak, all started to withdraw. The British trying to hold on to Southeast Asia, but in a way that, and also planning a gradual decolonization in a way that would result in a Southeast Asia that would be friendly to British interests and would support the Commonwealth. The Americans started to take a bigger interest in Southeast Asia, mainly because of Cold War considerations and the fear if they did not do a containment policy there by building alliances with friendly countries that were aligned to American values and political systems, then that place would fall prey to the communists. So this was the big picture that had emerged during that time. If you looked at the files of the British planners in the 1950s, you will come across this term which they use. It's called the grand design. The grand design. So they felt that the grand design would offer the way out, or the panacea to all these problems that we're facing. The grand design would achieve the following outcomes. One, Singapore's naval base would be secure, and Singapore would become part of a larger anti-communist political entity. In other words, it could join Malaya. So the grand design envisaged Singapore rejoining Malaya, and by rejoining Malaya, it would be secure in terms of its threat, in terms of a communist threat, and the naval base would be secure. And then you also plan for constitutional development to the politically underdeveloped states of the North Borneo territories by gradually, very gradually, giving political powers in various stages. You form political parties, you make sure that the political parties know what they are doing, then stage by stage you grant them limited home rule or self-government, leading ultimately to independence. The British say, okay, we've got to try to seal a deal. I'm coming back to the grand design, right? The grand design means putting everything together. So you had Singapore very interested, and I explained the reason why. The other territory is still not sure what's going to happen. Malaya not interested. So the British now played a very pivotal role in sealing this whole thing. And one was that they knew that while the Tunku was not interested in Singapore, he actually had his eyes on the North Borneo territories, especially Brunei, because of the oil wealth, and Brunei was also royalty, right? So, and then, you know, if you get the Sabah and Sarawak territories, it also enlarges Malaya. So basically, the deal was presented to Tunku. Take Singapore, and we will give you the rest. Lee Kuan Yew had a dilemma. His heart told him that he was still a Malaysian, that was the future of Singapore. His head was already telling him, giving him doubts. It's not working. Goh Keng Swee had no doubts. He was extremely hard-nosed. He said, why did we come into Malaysia? We wanted common market, no common market. We wanted special permits to set up industry. They were not approving our industry. And look at all the political mess, all the riots, all the attacks we are suffering. What's the point? Let's get out. And he created a file which he called Albatross. And Singapore prepared an instrument of separation in confidence, because they didn't want the British to know They know the British still wanted to hold them all together because of the grand design. And if the British knew about it, they would go and start talking to everybody to prevent this from happening. So the instrument of separation was prepared in absolute secrecy by E.W. Barker. And the signing, interestingly, was done individually. Rajaratnam, Toh Chin Chai, they were still anti-separation. They wanted to hold on. Lim Kim San and Goh Keng Swee were very clear we had to go. Ong Pang Boon was a Malaysian. He wanted to hold on. So even within the cabinet, it was split. So Lee Kuan Yew got one by one to come into the room, sign. They left by the back, and the next one came in. Because he didn't want the whole group to come together to tell him that he had made a mistake. And he really agonized over whether he had done the right thing. And that could account, in my view, for the tears that he shed when he spoke. Because he basically was, he fought all his life to get Singapore into Malaysia, and then it didn't work. But the second part of the interview you all should watch was that then he became defiant again, and he said, okay, let's move on. The deed's done. It cost him a lot of angst, but now that part of him, the nationalists, they say, okay, let's move on. Let's build Singapore from scratch. And that's what he did. But actually, if you look at the situation at the time, the PAP has also, Lee Kuan Yew has often been blamed for calling a cold stop. But actually, on his own, he was in no position to call it. So there was a constant debate between the Malayans, Singapore, and the British on who should pull the trigger. The Tunku's position was very clear. You are not going to come into Malaysia unless you get rid of all these leaders. So his condition was very clear. But he was not going to do it. Why should he dirty his hands? So he said, the British should do it. The British didn't want to do it because the British said, look, we already got all this bad publicity for taking very drastic military actions in Africa. They were criticized not only in Britain, they were criticized in international media, in international platform, in the United Nations. So they didn't want to take unilateral action. Lee Kuan Yew should do it. But, one would think that Lee Kuan Yew, or one would imagine that Lee Kuan Yew may have the power to do so, but he didn't really, because if he had done it unilaterally, he would have lost a lot of political support on the ground, and that might cause his political, he wanted it. I have no doubt he wanted to remove all those leaders, but he could not have done it unilaterally. So it had to be a combined effort. So in the end, it was the Internal Security Council that set together. It basically met all the objectives. This was also coincided with another external factor, and that was the Brunei Revolt in 1962. So while all these things were happening in Singapore, the Brunei Sultan was still deciding whether or not he should be part of the merger. Now, the Brunei Sultan this was the father of the current Sultan. He was a very clever man. So he wasn't sure whether the British would support him or not if there were a kind of an uprising in his sultanate. Now, it so happened that there was a revolutionary by the name of Azahari who started the People's Party of Brunei. And Azahari basically wanted to remove the sultanate and basically call for parliamentary democracy. Now, he started a little revolt to basically fight for independence of Brunei. Now, because he started it, the Barisan leaders advocated their support for him. But it turned out to be an armed insurrection that he was planning. So when the British intelligence forces got hold of that, they came to the conclusion that the Barisan Socialists was also planning something along those lines, that they had intentions. Whether it was there or not, we're not sure, but they had intentions of also following along the Azahari approach. Of course, the Azahari revolt was very short-lived because the British came in very decisively and defeated the forces. It had two effects. One, it really tainted, the Barisan was tainted by an open expression of support for the revolt. And this, in a way, gave cause to the Tunku, to the British, and by extension to Lee Kuan Yew, to believing that if they didn't do anything about it, there might be a similar action in Singapore. I think it's very clear that Lee Kuan Yew wanted independence from the British, and he wanted to achieve that. And he was using merger to achieve that. But what is the next phase? And that's not clear. I think it is very plausible that he saw Singapore as part of a Malaysia, as an autonomous state in Malaysia, and to flourish with Malaysia. So that was independence for him. Whether Singapore's independence on its own, event that happened in 1965, was something he had projected or he had anticipated, I don't think that was the case. Because his deal with the Tunku was that the Tunku would run KL like Washington, and Singapore would be the New York of Malaysia.